Thank you for the introduction. Hi. We are going to make some time travel into history right now. We don't go back that far, only until 1968. What happened in 1968? Well, Rasmus was born. Without Rasmus, there would be no PHP, there would be no PHPUnit, there would not be a conference like this, so we have to start with that. So 1968, that happened. 1969, Alan Kay and his team at Xerox PARC started to work on a radically new programming language called Smalltalk. And it was the interesting thing, or the seminal thing about Smalltalk was that it took ideas from language design and concepts like object-oriented programming from earlier attempts at that from languages like Simula, and combined that with advancement that had been made with regards to language runtime that came from the Lisp community. So this was the first real object-oriented programming language. Messages were sent between objects and so on, and we had a really good runtime where all of this was happening. And Smalltalk will become important 20 years down the line again. So 1978, of course, Rasmus had to be born for PHP to come about, so at some point I need to be born as well. So that happened in 1978. By the way, I'm 41 years old, and depending on who you ask, that's either really old or really young, I don't know. I feel neither old nor young, so 1978, that happened. And at some point, something happened to me that Robert C. Martin, Uncle Bob, referred to in a presentation that he gave a while back like this. There comes a moment in your life when maybe you were in a store somewhere where they had computers on display, and you walked up to one of these computers and you typed a little basic program in that would just print your name infinitely, going on forever, and you felt, yes, I'm the master of this machine, I'm a god, and now I know that I want to be a programmer. So something like that happened to me in 1986, when I was 8 years old. So I realized I want to be a programmer. Well, I didn't put it into exactly these words back then, but I knew I wanted to do something with computers. I want to make the computer do what I wanted it to do. And the reason for that is twofold. On the one hand, I watched this movie, and if you've never seen that movie, that's okay. That just means I'm really old, I know. But that movie inspired me to learn more about computers. So I walked to the local library and checked out all the books that they had, which was not that many at the time, and wanted to learn about computers, how they work, learned a little bit of BASIC and other programming languages because they had books on that. But I didn't have a computer, and it would take some more years for me to get a computer. So what did I do? I copied with pen and paper the listings that I found interesting and modified them on paper and hoped that they would work the way I intended them to work. Of course, they didn't, because programming on paper is stupid. But yeah, I didn't have a computer, so I needed something to do. So I mentioned earlier that Smalltalk will become relevant again. Well, in 1989, while I was starting high school, Kent Beck created SUnit, which was the first unit testing framework. It's the grandfather of all the XUnit test frameworks out there. Because he wanted to write automated tests, wanted to do automated testing for his Smalltalk applications. So 1990, I finally get a computer. It was this machine, the Amiga 500. Started doing BASIC on that machine, and quickly learned that BASIC is not really the right language to leverage the great CPU that the Amiga had, and especially not the right language to get to the hardware, to the low-level graphics chips that were in the Amiga. So I couldn't do what I wanted to do with that, so I needed to learn other languages. But because of school and other reasons, I did not get into that until I got a new computer in 1993. And that's a computer that I still have and I still use today. Not for real work, just for fun. Like every once in a while, I spend the weekend doing things and relearning things on that machine that I learned when I was like 12 years old. So on the Amiga 1200, I learned C and I learned assembly. And I started to work on real-time 2D and 3D graphics because I wanted to learn that. So I wrote code like this. Does anybody have an idea what this does? Probably not. So I found code like that when I dusted off my Amiga a couple of years ago and started doing things with it again. And I was looking at code like that, and I was like, what the hell? What does that do? And I couldn't figure out what it did. So I had to run it. And that's a problem. Software should be written in such a way that you can immediately see what it is about. But back then, nobody cared about that. Back then, we only cared about performance. We cared about most efficiently and effectively talk to the machine. So what this code, or what this piece of code does is, first of all, it turns the screen black. Then it draws a white line that moves up and down the screen. And it fills the area of the screen below that white line with a bright blue color. And of course, none of that is visible in the code. And that is a problem in itself. And the other problem, everything is global. So if you have a bigger application and you change something over here, suddenly things over there will break because everybody is using the same memory. And talking about memory, this is assembly language. We put values at specific addresses in memory to draw a pixel. And if we make a mistake in doing so, we crash the entire computer. That's not fun. So programming languages and software development has evolved a lot since then, thank God. And nowadays, we really strive to write code that is easy to understand, easy to maintain, and easy to test. To some degree, my assembler code that I wrote when I was like 12, 13, 14 years old looked a lot similar, at least in concept, to the first PHP code that I saw when I started to learn PHP later. We'll talk about that in a minute. So 1994 comes along, and what do you do when you are a hardware company and you make money by selling expensive hardware? Well, you create a programming language that needs lots of CPUs and lots of RAM. That was the motivation for Sun to publish a new programming language called Java in 1995. They published it in 1994. They started working on that. And they dusted off James Gosling's Oak and turned it into Java because they wanted to sell more hardware. So that happened in 1994. In 1995, Rasmus creates PHP. And he creates PHP because he wants to track information about the visitors of his website, which at the time was his CV, because he was looking for a job. The interesting thing about that is that he immediately published the solution that he built to solve his problem as open source and shared it on the internet with others. This is the, not email, but a news group, a Usenet posting from, 1995, from June 8, 1995, where Rasmus announces the availability of the initial version of PHP. Back then, PHP as an acronym stood for Personal Homepage Tools, because it was a set of tools written in C that he hooked via CGI into his web server to build his personal homepage. So what could you do with that first version of PHP? Depending through which perspective or through which lens you look at that. It could either do a lot, if you look at it from the 1995 perspective. If you look at it from the 2019 perspective, it couldn't do a whole lot. So it could do logging of accesses to your website. Well, you may wonder, why is that necessary to do in a language? Because the web server has an access log, but way back when, the users did not have access to the access log. So if you were not the administrator on the machine and you wanted to see how many visits do you have and where do they come from, you needed to implement your own solution. And back then, you needed to do that in C. So Rasmus knew C, so he wrote a solution in C, but he wrote it in such a way that others could use that as well without having to have C knowledge. So you do not need root access, you do not need server-side includes enabled, you do not need Perl or Tickle or any other kind of stuff installed on the web server. You just need this CGI binary, put it into your directory, and it just works. That was kind of innovative back in 1995. And that's actually Rasmus giving a presentation about this early history of PHP. This is where he was coming from. This is the C code that you had to write if you wanted to do basically a very simple hello world in your web server, and nobody should have to write assembly or C code to do that. The only alternative at the time was writing Perl code, and who wants to write Perl code, right? So he came up with this idea that you can embed code snippets into HTML that is automatically interpreted by the PHP processor running inside the web server, and that was the thing that got the whole PHP language started. It was not started to create a language, it was this solution that he wanted. 1997, probably the most prominent example of plane-driven development, meaning software development on the plane, which is what I usually do when I'm on a long flight and I'm bored and I can't sleep. I work on software. So 1997, Erich Gamma and Kent Beck fly from Zurich in Switzerland to Atlanta in the United States to attend a conference. Sitting next to each other, both of them were bored. Erich Gamma had an early version of Java on his laptop, and there was no testing framework yet for Java. So Kent Beck had, a couple of years before, created SUnit for Smalltalk, and he was getting into Java development. And he couldn't do proper Java development, in his opinion, without the testing framework. So what the two did on the plane was create JUnit, the first version of JUnit. In hindsight, they regret to immediately have shared this initial version at the conference, because that locked APIs into place, and they would have liked to keep that back a little and clean it up before they shared it with the world, but that's how it goes. 1997 is also the year where the second version of PHP comes out. It was not called PHP2, it was called PHPFI. FI for forms interpreter, because the big new thing was that you could suddenly handle forms. So variables that were sent to an HTML form ended up as global variables inside the request, inside PHP, its global scope, and you could process that and do things with forms. That's PHPFI. At the same time, two computer science students in Israel, Andy and Zev, are attending a class on compiler design. When they're not at university studying, they work at one of Israel's big internet service providers, and they do things with PHPFI. At some point, they realize that PHPFI is too slow for the kind of applications that their customers currently need. So they look, because PHP is open source, they can do that. They look into the source code of PHP, and they see, okay, this is written in C, we know C, we understand what's going on. And they're really surprised to see that there's no real compiler inside PHP. The early versions of PHP, like PHP and PHPFI, interpret the code as it is being executed line by line. So PHP would read one line and execute that one line and then go on to the next line, which may be fine until you run into things like loops and reusable code, because every time you need to call the same line, you need to understand it again and again and again, and this is really, really, really slow. So they said, we're currently learning about how to write a proper compiler, so why don't we do that for PHP? So they did, and that's what they submitted to Rasmus, and that was the foundation for PHP 3, which came out in 1998, which is just about the time when I get my first X86-based PC. That's when I put my Amiga 1200 into storage, into the attic, and haven't touched it since 2014, 2015. So I get my first PC. I'm in my first year at university, and suddenly I'm contacted by someone that I knew from the Amiga demo scene, a graphics artist, who says, well, I'm now doing internet development. I'm doing web applications. And until now, I was fine with just using Photoshop and Dreamweaver and whatever Microsoft front page was what was available at the time. And HTML was all I needed, but now suddenly I need something on the server side, and that's properly, at least to me, that looks like real programming, which I cannot do. So to him, as a graphics artist, server-side PHP programming was exactly the same as real-time 2D and 3D graphics, which he had known me from the Amiga demo scene. So he thought I could do that. But I couldn't, because I've never done that. So I told him, okay, so what programming language is available for that? And he said, well, you have the choice between Perl and PHP. So I looked at Perl first and decided after 1 or 2 hours that I do not want to work with that language. So I looked at the other language, and I haven't looked back since. So within a couple of days, I learned enough PHP to solve the problem that my friend was having. And then I needed to go back to university and was busy, and then it was only a year later in 1999 that I started to use PHP again, and that's also the point in time when I got involved in the PHP community. Right. And once I got involved in the PHP community, it felt normal for me and just right, and I didn't think about any other option when I created a library that I needed for something, that I published this as open source. Only recently, when I read a book by Jimmy Marr, The Future Was Here, I realized that this was probably due to the fact that I learned programming and got involved in programming back on the Amiga platform, because a lot of people migrated from the Amiga to Linux, and they had an open source mindset, and to people that grew up on the Amiga and on the C64, it just feels right to do open source, and publishing something as closed source is only a second option to them, if at all. So we are still in the PHP 3 days, but PHP 4 is on the horizon. So Stig Bakken, while waiting for his first child to be born, so he's in a hospital waiting for the child to be born, he's bored, he wants to pass the time, so he starts working on what later becomes known as PAIR, the PHP extensions and add-on repository, or application repository, sorry, which was the first mechanism for PHP developers to share their components and libraries. It would take a couple of years after that for the PAIR installer to come about, to automatically download these PAIR packages and install them. And it would take even longer for Pyram to come about, which enabled developers to have their own distribution channel and not to be bound to the pair.php.net central server where certain policies were in place on what you could and could not publish there. But pair was a big step for professionalizing PHP because we finally had a distribution format and distribution channels, and it made certain problems go away. But it also caused certain other problems, mainly because pair did not handle dependencies of your project on a per project basis. Pair packages were installed globally for all PHP applications running on the same machine. So you were in a lot of trouble and in a world of pain if you had different applications running on the same machine that needed the same dependencies but in different versions. That was a nightmare, and it would take a couple of years for that to get solved. It was not solved with pair. I think it was in May 2000, PHP 4 comes out. 2000 was a big year for PHP. PHP was at that time 5 years old. And as you see on the next slides, a lot of important things happened in 2000. PHP 4 comes out, which was a big step forward. It was in a lot of ways better than PHP 3. The Zend engine had evolved, the compiling and executing kernel. It was the first version of PHP that had plug-in support for the core of PHP, where you suddenly could install debuggers or even implement debuggers or bytecode caches or profilers for PHP. PHP 3 and earlier versions did not have the hooks in the kernel to allow for such extensions. 2000 is also the year when I started to contribute to PHP. Initially, I did Windows build fixes, then I started to fix some bugs. At some point, I added new features. So for instance, some features in the reflection API are from me, things like debug backtrace I heavily contributed to. Mostly minor issues like bumping the copyright year every year on January 1st until we automated that at some point, things like that. Mentioned earlier that 2000 was an important year for the PHP community, and mostly, at least from my personal experience and in my opinion, that's due to the fact that 2000 saw the world's first PHP conference. That was in October 2000 in Cologne, and it was the first time that some key figures from the PHP community got together. That was especially huge for the German PHP community, of course, because the conference was held in Germany. Hundreds of people were there. They met for the first time face-to-face, things like that. It was the year when a lot of user groups were founded across the world, where people started really to realize, okay, PHP, this language is it's not that new anymore. It's been around for 5 years. Chances are that it will be around for at least 5 more years, so we can get serious about that and have things like user groups, meetups, conferences, books, and so on. In 2000, Michael Feathers, who wrote the really good book, Dealing Effectively with Legacy Code, that you may have read, he creates CppUnit. CppUnit is the first port of JUnit. So heavily more inspired by JUnit than it is inspired by SUnit. He creates that around the same time that I start working on PHPUnit. And of course, we do not know about each other because we live in different communities. I started working in 2000 on PHPUnit because I was doing more and more PHP project work and got really, really frustrated about not being able to write tests, implement automated tests for my business logic. Why did I even know about that such a thing exists? Well, I knew about that from university. Was really lucky to have a professor at university who knew Erich Gamma and Kent Beck and got really early exposed to JUnit, and he taught us students about JUnit, and I was using it at university. and I wanted something like that for PHP. So I looked around, nothing like that existed until I found something called PHPUnit on SourceForge, which, remember, we are talking about 2000, this is before GitHub is about. Back then, SourceForge was the website, the hosting platform for open source projects, and there was already a project named PHPUnit, but it didn't work. I could not get this to work. I tried for a couple of days thinking I must be really, really stupid, I cannot get this to work. And then I saw emails on mailing lists and posts in forums that people said, no, we cannot get this to work either. This is really broken and it doesn't work. And I tried to reach out to the developer and never got an answer back. And to this day, that is still online at that URL. And the forum there is full of, this is not the PHP unit you're looking for, go somewhere else. But SourceForge doesn't close old projects that are abandoned, so that was a problem. And it was an even bigger problem for me because I wanted a place where I can host the source code for my PHP unit, for my test framework implementation. But I couldn't put it on SourceForge because where GitHub namespaces project names based on the user that has them there, SourceForge does no such thing. There can only be one project named PHPUnit on SourceForge, so I couldn't put it there. So while I started to work on PHPUnit in 2000, it would take a year until I finally published it, because at some point I realized, okay, this pair thing that Steek started is starting to take off. And since I was already contributing to PHP itself, I had credentials to put the code for PHPUnit onto cvs.php.net. So one day I just did, because I wanted to have version control. PHPUnit at that time had grown to 6 source code files. That's a lot. Not really. Nowadays it's a couple of hundred, but anyway, small beginnings back then. But it was too much for me that I was no longer comfortable with having that just sitting on my hard drive without version control, without backup. So I wanted to have it somewhere where people could actually access it and where I got history and everything. So that happened in November of 2001. This early version of PHPUnit was a line-by-line conversion of JUnit 3, which means that when I came to the line that printed JUnit by Erich Gamma and Kent Beck, I translated that line into PHPUnit by Sebastian Bergmann and didn't really think about what kind of effect that would have. And nowadays, I cannot go to a conference or a meetup or a customer where people don't tell me, yeah, I see your name every day on the console every time I run my tests. Sorry for that. 20 years later, it's probably too late to change that. Would be really weird to remove that now. I honestly did not think about that back then. I didn't want to do any advertisement or something like that. It just happened. The other thing to know about this early version of PHPUnit is that it did not have a test runner. It was a framework that allowed you to write your tests, but you had to write your own runner. You could not run your tests with PHPUnit. There was no command line tool. In hindsight, this sounds really stupid, but I was just, well, my only excuse is that I can say, well, I was following the example of Erich Gamma and Kent Beck, who did exactly the same for JUnit, because they said, well, we leave the implementation of the test runner up to the vendor of the IDE, because they did not think about, they did not want to run the tests on the command line like I prefer to do. They saw, okay, the Java IDE needs to implement this. There needs to be a button in the IDE, and only the vendor of the IDE knows what needs to happen when that button is pushed to run the tests. That was the idea there, as far as I understand it. So very soon after this initial version, I started to work on a command line test runner that would allow you to run the tests. This early version of PHPUnit was written for PHP 4, and it was really, really, really painful to write that version of PHPUnit because PHP 4 did not have exceptions. And at the core of the design of JUnit is the idea that all the tests pass all the time, and the failing test is an exception from this norm. So it makes perfect sense to use the language construct of an exception to mark that a test has failed. So the most tricky bit of this early version of PHPUnit, and the painful bit for me to implement, was an emulation of exceptions for PHP 4. And I was really, really, really happy when PHP 5 came out that I no longer needed that hack, that emulation of exceptions, because PHP 5 brought exceptions in the language. So that was really good. So on the same day that PHP 5.0 was released, I released PHPUnit 2, which was the first version with a test runner and no hacky exception emulation and so on. And that is a lot closer to the PHPUnit that we know today than the first version. It's basically a complete rewrite. 2005 saw the release of PHP 5.1. Some people say in a mean way, but they're actually right, in hindsight at least, that PHP 5.0 was an alpha quality release, PHP 5.1 was a beta quality release, and PHP 5.2 was the first stable version of PHP 5. So in 2005, PHP 5.1 came out. Next year, PHP 5.2 came out. And 2006 is, again, an important year for the PHP world. Not because I spent that year living in Norway in that apartment on the left. And by the way, that blue post box, or that blue mailbox on the right, that's the mailbox of Derek Rettans, the author of Xdebug. He was living upstairs in the house next to me. To some degree, that is important to the history of PHP because due to the fact that we were living close to each other and working at the same company, we spent a lot of time making PHPUnit better, making Xdebug better. That's the time when Xdebug learned code coverage. That's the time when PHPUnit learned stubbing and mocking and so on, because we needed this functionality at our place of work. But most important, or the real reason why I said that 2006 was an important year for PHP is that in 2006, a lot of the frameworks started. It's the year when Zen Framework started. It's the year when Easy Components started. It's the year when Symfony was open sourced and Symfony 1 came out, and Framework 1 came out, and so on. So a lot of the ecosystem as we know it today started back in 2006. It's also the year where I was no longer able to cope with CVS. I no longer wanted non-atomic commits and the slowness and the brittleness of CVS. So at the time, there was still no Git, but Subversion was there, but the PHP project didn't use that. But I wanted to work with that because having branches would be nice. Well, Subversion didn't really have branches, but what they had was a lot better than what CVS had. So at some point, I decided to create a Subversion server for PHPUnit on my own server. Well, not my own server, a server provided by Tobias Schlitt, who let me in as a guest on his server and hosted PHPUnit development there. It's the year where PHPUnit 3 came out. PHPUnit 3 was the major version of PHPUnit that was maintained for the longest time, which sounds like a good thing, but in hindsight, it's really a bad thing because I let a lot of people who contributed features wait for 2 or 3 years for that feature to make it into a release, and that was frustrating to everybody. It was not really motivating for people to contribute features to PHPUnit if they had to wait this long for the feature to make it into a public release. Which is why later on I changed the release schedule to be a new major release every year, but we'll get to that in a bit. Fast forward to 2009. Of course, this is a personal history, I guess. So an important thing that happened for me in 2009 is that I founded a company, the PHP consulting company, together with my friends Arne and Stefan. Because just building open source software does not put food on the table and does not pay for the rent. I have to do, this comes as a surprise to a lot of people. I have to work to make a living. I cannot live from just doing open source, unfortunately. So my company does consulting, coaching, and training, basically everything that is related to knowledge transfer to PHP projects and related technologies around the PHP stack. So we celebrate our 10th anniversary this year, and that's all the advertisement you are going to get from me. Back to PHP. Probably the biggest step forward in the PHP 5 line was the release of PHP 5.3. So after PHP 5.2 had come out, development of PHP 6 was started. And as you may know, PHP 6 was never released. PHP 6 was started with the big goal we need to support Unicode at every level in the language. And that was, to a huge degree, started and sponsored by Yahoo, who operated at the time all across the world, and they needed good Unicode support. So a lot of they had a lot of PHP core developers on their staff that worked on getting the engine Unicode ready. And at some point, enough Unicode work was done so that it would work for Yahoo, but it would not work for everybody else. And a lot of extensions needed to be maintained, and there was a lot of problems with regard to, okay, if I turn on the Unicode support, then PHP suddenly gets a lot slower because all string operations, even if they do not require multi-byte, it was a mess. And at some point, everybody was frustrated and nobody wanted to continue to work on PHP 6 anymore. That's when the decision was made to take the current state of PHP 6, cut out all these Unicode changes that nobody really wanted anymore, and release that as PHP 5.3. And probably the biggest step forward in PHP 5.3 was namespaces. Because now suddenly it was possible to have classes of the same name in different packages and without any name clashes, and that was a huge enabler for innovation in the PHP library ecosystem. It was such an anticipated and important release that on the same day, all across the world, there were release parties for the first time for a PHP release. I was lucky enough to be able to attend the biggest one in Munich, Germany, which had a traditional pork roast and everything and lots of beer, which I am not interested in as I don't drink alcohol, but the food was quite nice. And the release masters, the release managers for that release, Johannes and Pierre were there, and we had a nice celebration and some nice discussions about PHP in the future, and it was a great evening. In 2009, I moved the development of PHPUnit from Subversion to GitHub. And that dramatically increased the number of contributions that I got. Before, it was really hard for somebody to contribute to PHP because the only thing that they could do was send a patch by email, because neither CVS nor Subversion have the concept of pull requests. And the biggest problem with that is somebody sends me a patch, I apply the patch and make the commit, and to version control, it looks like I made that change. I'm the author of that change. And that's not motivating for a lot of developers because they want to say, hey, they want to prove I contributed to this important open source project. My name is in the history, and neither CVS nor Subversion can give you that. So GitHub not only solved this psychological issue, but it also solved all the technical difficulties when it comes to contributing to an open source project that Subversion had. Huge step forward for the PHP ecosystem in 2011 when Niels and Jordi started to work on Composer. In the years after, more and more really important projects in the PHP ecosystem move away from pair and use Composer instead, until at some point basically everybody is using Composer and nobody is using pair anymore, which, as we learned the hard way early this year when the pair.php.net server was compromised, is not really the case, because still a lot of people use pair packages and install packages from there. And yeah, don't do that. PHP community has moved past that. So that was in 2011. 2012, PHP 5.4 comes out. Important thing about PHP 5.4, it's not really a feature that was in there, but the process that led to this release. This is the first release that follows the new RFC process that was established for PHP. And that came about because a student from Germany one day came to the mailing list, and he came to the mailing list not like a lot of people came to the mailing list before him. Before that, it was usually PHP is stupid because it does not have this feature, and if you do not implement this feature in the next 12 months, I'm going to stop using PHP and go to other language, which is a stupid way to open a conversation, especially with volunteers that are not paid to work on the language that you use. So the way that Stefan Mahr came to the mailing list was, I have this problem, and he described this problem, and at university I learned about this solution that other languages like Scala, for instance, have, and he explained the solution and he explained the concept, and he said, then I realized, yes, this is the right solution for that, so I implemented that language feature for PHP, and here is my proof of concept, and here is the documentation, and here are the tests. Do you think that this would be useful to have in PHP? And that led to the PHP developers to realize that they do not want to work any other way anymore. Like all major features now that change the syntax of the language at least have to come in a way like that. Not necessarily with the implementation, that is a nice bonus, but please, in a clean and structured way, describe the problem that you have, describe the solution that you propose, and even if you do not know C, write the tests or write at least some tests or examples at least that show how that feature would be used, so that we can get an idea for what it is that you're proposing. That was a huge step forward for PHP. PHPUnit 3.7 comes out, which as a point release does not sound really interesting, but it was the first version of PHPUnit that was installable using Composer. Was still installable through the pair installer, but it was the first version that was installable through Composer. It was also the first version of PHPUnit that was distributed as a FAR, as a PHP archive, like a single file that you can download that contains all the source code for PHPUnit and its dependencies, which is really useful and, in my opinion, the best way to use PHPUnit. PHP 5.5 comes out, and it was after the release of PHP 5.5 that suddenly the topic of performance became very important in the PHP community. Why? Because Facebook had announced the original hip-hop VM, the predecessor to HHVM. So hip-hop was the source code transformation tool from PHP code to C++ code that was then compiled using G++ into ginormous, many gigabytes in size binaries. But while that was something completely new and not 100% compatible, and it required completely changing the way that you deploy your software, it was appealing to a lot of users of PHP out there because it dramatically improved the performance. So the PHP core developers started to think about how can we make PHP faster. And in summer of 2014, there was this email from Dimitri to the internals mailing list saying, I have experimented with something and I'm proposing something, and this is basically the proposal of PHPNG, the next generation of the compiling and executing kernel, what would eventually lead to PHP 7. Right, but before we get to that, there was one final minor release of PHP 5, PHP 5.6, which came out in 2014. Also the year where PHPUnit 4 came out, and PHPUnit 4 is the first release with the new release cycle, one major version per year. It didn't work the first 1.5 years or so, but ever since then, there's a steady release cycle with new features every 8 weeks, and every year in February, a clean-up release where everything that is deprecated is removed, support for old PHP versions is removed, and so on. 2015, PHP 7 comes out, which is really, really great. Lots of improvements in the type system and in the performance. No more fatal errors, etc. PHPUnit 5 comes out. 2016, Composer is finally stable enough that Niels and Jordi feel comfortable to put a version number on it that is 1.0.0. To celebrate the occasion, they took an old-fashioned floppy disk, put a Composer file on the floppy disk, painted the floppy golden, and put it up on eBay. And it made them quite some money. 2016, PHP 7.1 comes out with some more performance improvements, little ones, not like 7 versus 5, but still. The void return type declaration, asynchronous signal support, and so on. Lots of good stuff. PHPUnit 6 comes out, which is the first version of PHPUnit that is finally namespaced, which was requested for a long time because people said, oh, it really looks ugly when I write my nice, clean, namespaced code, and then I have to extend PHPUnit _ framework _ test case. And as soon as I released the namespaced version of PHPUnit, everybody was complaining, oh, now I need to change all my tests. Sorry about that. PHP 7.2, PHPUnit 7, PHP 7.3 came out last year. Performance has improved a lot, even over the course of the 7 minor releases. On the left, you do not really need to read the numbers. On the very left is PHP 5.3. On the right is PHP 7.3. Sorry, I don't have any benchmarks yet for PHP 7.4, which was released last week. Oh, this week, actually. No, last Sunday starts the new week. Yeah, last week, sorry. And PHP 5.3 for WordPress was able to do on that machine 140 requests per second, where PHP 7.3 can do 520 requests per second. That is quite something. And it does that with a lot less memory, where PHP 5.3 needed 140 megabytes of memory. PHP 7.3 only needs 15 megabytes, which is quite a resource consumption. It's good for the environment, it's faster, and it is faster using less power. So that's good. This year, PHPUnit 8 came out. Just because a new major version of PHPUnit comes out does not mean that there are major new features in it. It's just an annual opportunity to clean up and remove functionality that is no longer needed and has been marked as deprecated before. PHPUnit finally has a logo. Did not have a logo before. This is what it looks like. Earlier this year, I asked my favorite board game illustrator to design a logo for PHPUnit, and Ian O'Toole came up with that logo, which is quite nice. If you look closely within the letters of the PHP, you can see the elephant with the trunk, and you need some fantasy for that. If you are like most developers and like stickers, I brought some PHPUnit stickers. Feel free to take one after the presentation. Just a couple of days ago, PHP 7.4 was released, which is the last minor release of PHP 7. The next version after that will be PHP 8, which probably, likely, hopefully comes next year, a year from now. PHP 7.4, again, is a bit faster, but it can improve performance a lot more thanks to a new feature called preloading. So at the moment, applications use auto-loading to load the code for classes, interfaces, and traits. And the way that auto-loading works is when a class is used for the first time and the code for that class has not been loaded yet, a callback is called that figures out how to load the code for that class. And of course, probably in production, you use a bytecode cache, and the code for that class has already been compiled in a previous request, and it can be reused. But the autoloader still triggers the first time that class is used in a request, and then the autoloader needs to execute and then load the source code file, and only at that point in time, PHP realizes, oh, I have seen that source code before, I do not need to compile it again, and it goes back into the execution context. That takes a couple of nanoseconds, milliseconds, microseconds, whatever, but that's time that can be saved. And it adds up if you have a lot of code in your application. That's where preloading comes into place, where you explicitly configure the source code for your application, and PHP then ensures that all of that source code is available at request startup, so you no longer need the autoloader. And that can dramatically improve performance of your application. Another new feature in PHP 7.4 is the foreign function interface, FFI, which allows you to directly use any library that is written in C or C++ that comes as a shared object. You no longer need to write an extension in C for the PHP runtime to reuse that code. You write a little bit of PHP glue code that maps from the scope of the library to the scope of PHP, and that will greatly improve developer experience when there's functionality that you want to reuse that has no extension. You just take the library. You may need a little bit of like superficial C knowledge to understand what the library does and what data types you need to provide and so on, but you can write you only need to write a little bit of PHP code that does the mapping, and I'm pretty sure that at some point we'll have code generators that just look at the C library's header file and automatically generate the PHP code that you need to use that code. That's really, that's on the one hand really nice. On the other hand, it's really scary from a security perspective, because now you can use any library without really knowing what's going on. But you need to configure your web server properly so that not everything is FFI-able and so on. The most important thing that happened over the last 2 years for PHPUnit is code sprints. So 2.5, 3 years ago, I started to do every couple of months code sprints, events that run for 2 days that are hosted by a company that wants to support PHPUnit development, which basically means that the company provides a room and some soft drinks and some snacks, and then 15 to 20 people that want to contribute to PHPUnit show up. And I teach them, I coach them, I show them how to contribute to PHPUnit, how to fix bugs, how to implement new features. And for 2 days, we work on bugs, on new features, on cleaning up PHPUnit's code, because after 20 years, there's a lot of really unclean code in PHPUnit that I'm not proud of, that really needs to go away. So we do that. And that's really great. And we're currently working on a complete rewrite of how PHPUnit's extension system works and how PHPUnit's logging system works. That will hopefully be ready for PHPUnit 9, which comes out in February. And that will make extending and customizing and adapting PHPUnit a whole lot easier. Just a week ago, I had a meeting with the Symfony core developers. Symfony has a PHPUnit, something called the PHPUnit bridge, which by our current estimate will be superfluous a year from now, because all that they need in there will be available as functionality in PHPUnit and for everybody else to use, which is good. And I'm extremely thankful for everybody who contributes to PHPUnit. For instance, PHPUnit documentation has a Japanese translation that at some point just showed up out of nowhere. When that was initially worked on, I was a bit skeptical because, of course, I don't know Japanese, so somebody sent me something and wanted me to publish it on PHPUnit's website, and I didn't know, is this really a translation of my documentation, or is this some completely different text? And at the time, I was working in Norway, and I had a Japanese colleague, and I asked her, is this actually a translation of that? And she said, yeah, not only is that a translation, but this is actually quite good Japanese. You want this translation. I said, OK. So ever since then, this is happening. So I'm thankful for everybody who contributes to PHPUnit. And maybe at some point, we can have a code sprint here in Japan or in Asia, or I don't know. So far, these code sprints only have happened in Europe. Briefly looking at next year, PHPUnit 9 will come out in February. Most of the work has already been done for PHPUnit 9, like deleting all the code. November and December are my favorite months of the year for working on PHPUnit, because it means I can delete a lot of old code. Features that I deprecated a while ago can finally remove. So now would be the time, if your tests work with PHPUnit 8, try if they work with master, and give feedback if you think I removed something that I shouldn't have removed. Next year, we'll see the 20th anniversary of PHPUnit. Next year, we'll hopefully see the release of PHP 8, and it will be the 25th anniversary of PHP itself. So that was a brief look at the history of PHP in general and PHPUnit in particular through my personal lens on that, my personal perspective. I hope that this was interesting and at least a little bit entertaining. So thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions whatsoever regarding PHPUnit or PHP, please do not hesitate. I'm here all day. Just approach me. You don't have to be scared or afraid of me. I'm just a regular person who just happened 20 years ago to have the problem that there was no testing framework for PHP and wanted that. And I waited for a bit. I hoped that somebody would do that. Eventually, I did it to make the pain go away, and I published it as open source. And the rest is the history that I've just showed you. So please don't hesitate to contact me. I look forward to answering all your questions. Thank you.